So this is the sort of final part of our discussion today. It's a great honour to welcome John Sawyers, 36 years a public servant. From 2009 to 2014, he was the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service. And prior to that, he'd had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. From 2019, he has run Newbritge Advisory. So Sir John will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have opportunity for some discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kerry, and thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you, Kerry, and thank you, everyone, for coming along this afternoon. I've been reading the NBR report on China digital strategy, and I must say it's a very thorough and well thought through document, and it's very timely as well as we look at authoritarianism in the world and how we can best use technology to defend our values and to protect our freedoms against some who might have different ideas. And it's very good to be back here at King's College. I'm proud to say I'm a visiting professor here in the War Studies Department. And it's a great pleasure to be with you today. In reading the NBR report, several things struck me. There's Emily de la Briere's analysis of how Chinese strategy is not just about commercial advantage and intelligence collection and cybersecurity. It's about digitally empowered authoritarianism. Nigel Corey showed how China is leveraging its position in UN agencies to push international standards on data governance towards national control so governments can do what they want with data and use it for national security purposes. And I was struck by Matt Turpin's conclusion that China's building a digital platform and an infrastructure to create an operating system for a new illiberal international order. And those findings should worry us all. Of course, the news isn't all bad. There are areas where China lags behind the West in technology, and I was struck by an analysis in The Economist magazine last month where they started with a report of what they described as a harsh appraisal of China's lagging performance written by a Chinese academic at Beijing University. Of course, it was only a matter of days before that harsh appraisal was taken down by the authorities. But some people still make a lazy assumption, and I think we need to address this squarely. China is just as good as us at innovation. As centuries ago, China invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass well before the Europeans did and before the United States was even thought of. And the Chinese today are just as good as Americans and Europeans at developing new technology. Look at how they conquered coding in their traditional writing style. The real competition isn't over whose engineers are more clever. It's whether the systems they each work in provides the resources and incentives for top-class research and the scope to turn that into healthy new businesses. I'm going to step back a bit today to look at the challenges and priorities of the Chinese leadership in this seminal year for President Xi Jinping, and I'll bring it back to technology and what it means for tech competition towards the end. Well, this autumn, as we all know, the Chinese Communist Party will hold its party congress, which meets every 5 years to set the party's direction and to choose a new set of leaders. And this year we'll see a higher turnover of leaders than normal. If the party's rules on age limits are abided by, some 60% of Central Committee members, half the Politburo, and 3 out of 7 of the Politburo Standing Committee will be replaced. Now, that generation of leaders, which is retiring, they came of age in the Maoist chaos of the 1960s and early 70s. The incoming leaders' formative years were in the Deng Xiaoping era of reform and opening up, and we'll wait to see if that makes a difference. But they did have a very different experience of youth. Now, choosing the successor generation is going to be a huge priority for President Xi Jinping. He wants them to be both capable and loyal. And as we know, those two qualities don't always go hand in hand. And the one exception to the party's age limits is set to be President Xi himself. He changed the Chinese constitution 5 years ago to allow him to serve a 3rd term as president. And there is every reason to believe that he will emerge from the 20th Party Congress as the most powerful figure in China for a third 5-year term. And who knows, that might pave the way for a fourth or fifth term in power. But securing his own election is not assured. When you suppress criticism and drive policy debate, or you prevent debate on policy options, you drive opposition underground. And there are many in China who feel aggrieved by Xi Jinping, not least the 900,000 members of the party who are victims of the anti-corruption purges, not to mention all those party members who look to those who were purged for patronage. Now, I don't have any much doubt that Xi Jinping will succeed in securing a third term in power, but he'll be cautious this year, and he faces real difficulties. While we in Europe and North America are emerging from the COVID pandemic, China is still stuck in endless lockdowns and travel bans as it tries to stamp out the virus. I don't think he's going to give up on that strategy, not least because Chinese vaccines have a low level of effectiveness. And if the Omicron variant breaks out in China in a big way, it will be a severe embarrassment for President Xi. Hong Kong's daily death rate from COVID has risen to 35 per million of population. That's every day. Now, if that happened on the mainland, we'd be seeing huge numbers of people dying. And partly as a consequence of COVID, China's economy is flagging, especially the real estate sector that amounts to about 30% of China's GDP. Now, the Economic Work Conference of the CCP signalled a determination to keep economic growth going, with a new emphasis on stability. And Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister, reinforced their message at last week's National People's Congress. I think we're likely to see the Chinese authorities engineer a soft landing for the real estate sector, which will see steps to protect consumers from food and energy prices, but all that means creating yet more debt to keep economic growth at around 5%. Now, President Xi does not want to court more risk in 2022 or attract new disruption. No doubt to his relief, the Winter Olympics passed off well enough for China. But now President Xi has to deal with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the consequences for his country. From Beijing, Putin's war has brought some advantages. This was their friend. There were to be no limits on China-Russia cooperation, according to the communique following President Putin's February visit to Beijing. The war was taking the attention of the United States away from the 21st century rivalry with China and pulling them back into a 20th century security challenge in Europe. I expect China to be fairly happy for Putin to distract America in this way and to test America's resolve so they can see the results and learn from the lessons. And Russia itself is China's junior partner in the axis of authoritarianism. Putin's war meant that Russia was set to become even more dependent on China, not least for its energy trade. And Russian banks, excluded from SWIFT, would have to use China's new renminbi-based financial transaction clearance system, known as CIPS, helping China reduce its own dependence on the mighty dollar. And China's leverage in Central Asia, the Arctic, and even vis-à-vis India could be strengthened at Russia's expense. So if you're in Beijing, what's not to like about Putin's war? Well, several things. First, China sets real store by the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference, because they underpin their own positions on Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. To have these principles trampled on by their friend Vladimir is, to say the least, awkward. And second, the stark military lessons of fighting a war of aggression against an entity, in this case a state, determined to preserve its self-determination, was a reminder not to underestimate your enemy when they are defending their way of life. And that carries uncomfortable lessons for China's ambitions towards Taiwan. And third, the new generation of sanctions that the West has introduced in response to the Russian invasion will have sent a shiver down Chinese spines. Russian banks have been closed off from hard currency dealings, and China is at risk of being pulled into the sanctions net if their banks help the Russians out of their predicament. And half of Russia's $640 billion of foreign reserves has been frozen. Much of Putin's carefully nurtured war chest is now out of reach. Now, hawkish Chinese commentators have long warned of their own reserves, mostly held in US treasuries, are vulnerable in a crisis. And they now have added material to back that concern. You also have to add in the energy and food security crises created by Putin's war. Ukraine is one of the world's breadbaskets. China imports 2/3 of its barley and some 20% of its corn from Ukraine. Global prices for wheat are soaring. Energy costs are higher too. Efforts to address the climate crisis, which is important to China, they risk being delayed. And seen in this light, Putin's war is not such good news for China. So how will China maneuver between these difficulties? Well, as Joe Lai said in a different context, it's too early to tell. We can be sure that China's highest foreign policy priority will remain its rivalry with the United States. China remains convinced the United States is bent on holding back China's growth as a world power. I expect China to put those strategic interests first. They will do what they can to support Russia, but they will be careful not to be hit with secondary US sanctions, which would further set back their economic growth. And today's meeting in Rome between Jake Sullivan and Yang Qishe will helpfully reinforce that risk. The West's sanctions against Russia will add to China's determination to reduce its dependence on the dollar. But there are limits to what they can do as long as the renminbi is not convertible. The core of the US-China rivalry will be in technology. China will be determined to move even faster to break out of the stranglehold technology that the West holds over them. Semiconductors is the most prominent, but it's not the only one. The US leads on operating systems. America's tech platforms are used globally. The West is way ahead of China on agricultural technology. All these gaps and others, China will want to close. And China will aim to end their supply chain dependence on the West and at the same time to entrench Western dependence on China. We saw the effects of that on low-tech products that were vital in tackling the pandemic. China wants to replicate that in the high-tech sectors. And data will be at the heart of the struggle. Data is the modern-day coin of power, especially when combined with artificial intelligence to manipulate that data. We have seen how China has tightened its regulations governing the export of data. Companies operating in China have to hold their data there and not allow it out of the country, lest it damage China's own sense of its national security. And this is now impacting capital markets as well. Chinese companies are being refused permission by both Beijing and the West to launch IPOs in Western financial centers. Foreign investment is welcome in China, but only as long as it follows China's rules of the game. So what do we do? Well, the NBR's report on China's digital strategy sets out a series of recommendations for policymakers, and I think they bear very careful examination. I'm delighted to hear that the NBR team are talking to policymakers in Paris and London and Washington and elsewhere as they take forward those ideas. Some of the work has started. It's easier now to block Chinese takeovers of Western technology companies. It's more straightforward to prevent the commissioning by China of vital research and development from our universities, and to build a regulatory framework to protect both our privacy and our security. But there's still a long way to go. European Union's proposed Digital Markets Act has as its priority to promote competition, which is an important consideration. But as presently drafted, it puts at risk the security and privacy of some of our most important personal data, much of which we access through our mobile phone. A hostile state will have an open goal if new competition rules in Europe lead to our most secure tech ecosystems being undermined. And judging from the consultation document put out by Whitehall's Business Department, the UK's planned regulations is heading towards the same error as the European Union's. And meanwhile, America's regulatory effort isn't even out of the starting blocks because of the dysfunction of American politics, preventing legislation on digital and data security. We all need to get this regulation right and adopt it soon. But above all, we must remain on the front foot in the competition with China. We in the West won't recover our strategic monopoly on technology, but we can use technology to support our liberal democracies. We shouldn't assume that technology is on the side of the autocrat. For example, blockchain can be used to empower citizens by creating decentralized systems. And using artificial intelligence, we can preserve our privacy, but still enable those who threaten our society, the terrorist, the child exploiter, the Russian spy, to be identified. It's only the privacy of those who pose a danger to our society needs to be invaded. And we're seeing good examples in Ukraine where top-line technology has been used to fight back against the Russians. Free information is anathema to President Putin, as we are seeing with Russian moves in the last couple of days to close down vital social media channels like Instagram. But Ukraine is showing the way in tech-enabled cyber attacks on Russia itself and in its information operations, which are as good as anything we've seen from the Russians recently. And I welcome Elon Musk's delivery of satellite terminals for his Starlink system, which helps Ukrainians access the internet and spread their own experience and views in ways that the Russians cannot monitor or disrupt. So what do I say in conclusion? I think the first is that technology is at the heart of the 21st century struggle for power and the battle for the survival of our values. The NBR report we are discussing today is a vital wake-up call for political and business leaders across the free world. In historical terms, democracy and accountability of leaders is the exception to the way human societies have organized themselves. But authoritarianism is a dead end. The greatest strides in progress and prosperity came with the end of absolutist rule in Europe, for example, in the Renaissance city-states. Dictatorships have nothing to offer the young, the ambitious, and the striving. We are engaged in a struggle to preserve liberal democratic values and the system of international order that's prevailed since 1945. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a raw reminder of how a nation's freedom can be destroyed. China operates in a more subtle way, but is no less determined in pursuit of its goals. Yes, we need to work with China on many issues, like climate change and global health. But at the same time, we have to be smart, to work together with our allies to make sure that technology is used to advance freedom, not to end it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. You said towards the end that we, I presume meaning North America, Europe and liberal democracies, are engaged in a battle to defend our values, to defend who we are, what we believe is, kind of right. Are we panicking?
I don't think we're panicking. I think we've been made aware that we've been distracted for a number of years. We've engaged in anger against our own system. Maybe this has its roots in the 2008 financial crash. Maybe it's added to by some of the military engagements we've had over the last 20 years. But I think we've seen the growth of populism in North America and in Europe and elsewhere, driven by inequality and a sense of injustice and anger at our own governments. I think that's meant we've taken our eye off the ball. And it's certainly given a perception to people like President Putin that we are weak and can be exploited. I think the reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine has helped correct some of those impressions. It certainly reinforced the transatlantic unity. And it has, I think, galvanized the sense of common purpose in the West to react against it. I don't think we're panicking. Certainly, the action that we've taken in response to that has been quite measured. The Americans have done a very good job orchestrating an international response. And when people come out with ideas which are, frankly, slightly over the top, which could lead to a direct confrontation, not between Ukraine and Russia, but between NATO and Russia, like the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine or providing high-profile equipment like fighter aircraft, there's been a pause and said, no, we don't want to go down that road. This is not NATO's fight, but we will help Ukrainians in their fight. So I think the response has been measured. I don't think we're panicking, but I do think we've had a salutary reminder after a long period when we've been rather internally and negatively focused.
And in terms of, I mean, a lot of our discussion earlier in the first and second panel was about engagement. Is it still possible? And I think there are obviously differing views.
Engagement with?
Engagement with China, particularly in digital issues between the United States and Europe, for instance. If you're a policy, you're giving policy advice for a long time in your career, where would you sort of stand on that argument? Would you say that we need to digitally decouple if that's possible, or we need to engage, we have no choice but to engage?
Well, certainly at a political level, diplomatic level, we should certainly engage. And the essence of diplomacy isn't talking to people who agree with you, it's talking to people who disagree with you. I've been a lifelong supporter of maintaining communication and having deep engagement as far as you can with countries, whether it's Russia or Iran. China is rather different, but there's lots we can do with China to engage with, which makes engagement with China worthwhile. And even areas where there is more of a sort of confrontational approach, it's really important to communicate each side's position. And I think Jake Sullivan will be doing that with Yang Jieshi today in Rome. So I think engagement really is important. Now, how do you engage on an issue where, in a sense, the two sides have got too deeply entwined? And there's a very important report from the Pentagon a couple of years ago which showed the extent of which America's key defense systems were dependent upon components from China. And not surprisingly, the Pentagon wanted to get out of that, so they were self-sufficient in those components. And China is doing exactly the same to reduce its supply chain dependencies. Now, that doesn't mean that somehow globalization has come to an end and the two biggest economies in the world are going to go their completely separate ways. But there will be areas of that interface where you have to take greater caution than perhaps we did in the early years of really enthusiastic globalization. And that sense of strategic rivalry needs to be managed at the highest levels and at all levels, including in Europe as well as with Europe and Japan, Australia, India, as well as directly between China and the United States. And I think that requires an active engagement, active diplomacy, but a clear-eyed one as well, and a willingness to disagree when necessary.
And just finally, before I maybe open it up for a couple of questions from the floor, you talked, very persuasively about how there are many ways in which what Putin has done is not super great for China. I mean, we often deal with narratives. Diplomacy, I suppose, is often about narratives, and politics too. If China, and I know it's very, very fanciful, but if it does play a constructive role in putting using its leverage on Putin and sorting this mess out, what do we do about the big China threat narrative then?
Well, I think you are making quite a big assumption. I can't recall an issue where China has intervened as a mediator in a dispute. China doesn't really believe in that sort of diplomacy. The risks of failure are too high. So, first of all, I think it is a theoretical question you're asking. But secondly, I do think that if someone can find a ladder for Putin to climb down, I have to say, I was struck by the optimistic words coming out last night about the various contacts, but I'm not that encouraged. And I do think that this is Putin's war. He has set it off, and he's not engaged in this diplomatic process. And certainly those who have had contacts with him, like President Macron of France, have come away pretty desolate about the prospects of making progress with Putin. But if he can be persuaded to withdraw and reach a settlement with the Ukrainian government, recognizing that Ukraine is a sovereign and independent country, then I think there will be. China will look at this quite carefully. I was never one of those who believed that China was itching to send the troops across to Taiwan. I thought that was an exaggerated fear. Again, that's not really in China's tradition. Yes, I'm clear that President Xi Jinping has a strategic goal of reintegrating Taiwan with China. But he's not in a hurry to do that. I think this could be something that will be more of a priority as the years go by. And it may be that the lessons of Ukraine suggest that the rather wild ideas of a Chinese invasion, like Normandy in 1944, is really very unrealistic. And maybe some of the wilder ideas in the Chinese military, they might also have second thoughts about it. So I don't think we're going to see an end to this narrative of rivalry and a degree of hostility. It's about the only thing that unites people on Capitol Hill these days is hostility towards China, and some of it is overdone. I think the Biden administration and Kirk Campbell, the strategic framework that he's put forward, I think that is a reasonable and sensible way to go ahead. But part of the problem we all have, not least China has, is the unpredictability of American politics and whether it will swing back and forth rather wildly over the next 20 years, or whether there will be some consistency in foreign policy, which is what they thought they could be used to for most of the time, well, since 1972 and the remaking of China-US relations.
Great. Is there maybe any questions from the audience? Anything? Not every day you get an opportunity to ask the former director of the Secret Intelligence Service what he knows. So please, yeah, okay, yes, the lady there. Yeah. Sorry, if you could just wait for the just coming out. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
We've seen an increase of xenophobia attacks to Russians in the UK and worldwide as this conflict has emerged. And given that China is often portrayed as an enemy and hostile, with a hostile approach in the media, and because of the China threat, how do we kind of ensure that there isn't an increase of xenophobia towards Chinese people, and what role do policymakers in ensuring that there's often like a more nuanced and increased understanding of China?
Great, and then maybe one more. Is there another question?
The lady with the hat here. Yeah.
The lady with the hat? Well, maybe we have three then. Lady with the hat and then the gentleman and then... yeah.
Hi, thanks for the sharing. So I just have one question regarding the engagement with China. So what sort of meaningful engagement you would say in the West, given the political situation right now? Because 30 years ago, like the West indeed tried to engage China with more of commercial ties, set up joint ventures, and only realized later it's not possible, and it's like giant failure to engage China into democracy. So right now you still promote engagement with China, but what sort of engagement would look like? I myself cannot really picture a sort of meaningful engagement. Maybe you have more insight into it. Thank you.
And then maybe finally the gentleman just behind. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, hi. I think China was last battle-tested, I think, during the Vietnam incursion in '79. Do you think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its basically fact that it hasn't been battle-tested very well in Ukraine, is that giving China pause for thought in terms of its conventional weapons? Will it then seek to somehow improve them?
Great, thank you. So xenophobia, meaningful engagement, and pause for thought on combat.
There's always a tension between dealing with a state you consider hostile and dealing with individuals that were people of that state. I mean, I remember in this country during the Second World War, there were German people were interned. The same happened to Japanese people in the United States. And I think we've moved beyond that now. But equally, there's a degree of anger against all things Russian in this country because of what we're witnessing on our screens in Ukraine. Now, the people who are targets of that abuse are not personally responsible. They're probably here to evade being part of Putin's Russia. But there's one can't deny where one comes from and the connections that one has. So I deplore any sort of xenophobia aimed at individuals. At the same time, we do have to be careful. We have to be careful, for example, about the reach of hostile intelligence services, many of whom use nationals or former nationals as a vehicle for advancing their interests, and that's an issue which we need to be mindful of. On engagement, I think we're seeing a huge amount of engagement between the West and China. Yes, there's been areas where it's pulled back a little bit, but you look at the role of Western banks or technology companies, manufacturing industry. Everybody's got massive supply chain links into China. And China's got massive connections into Western capital markets. It too has supply chain issues. You see professional services firms very active operating in China. So the level of engagement is very, very high. When Kerry asked me about engagement, I interpreted it as meaning more political engagement and diplomatic engagement. And I think that is very important as well. There's no point engaging in what a former British Foreign Secretary called megaphone diplomacy. There's no point just standing 1,000 miles away and just blasting your message over the airways. You've got to engage with people. You've got to do this with a degree of confidence. Now, I'm sure, for example, after this afternoon's meeting in Rome, both Yang Jiechi and Jake Sullivan will say something to the media, but they will not repeat the full detail of their discourse. And I think it's absolutely right that they shouldn't do so. So that engagement needs to take place at different levels, political, diplomatic, commercial, financial, and it needs to be done, some inevitably in the open. We live in very open societies these days, but some also behind closed doors. So I think that's the sort of engagement we should be conceiving of. As for the Chinese military, I was talking to one expert on the Russian military the other day, who said he'd spent most of his career trying to persuade people that the Russians aren't 10 feet tall when it comes to the military. He's now finding he's having to tell people the Russians aren't 4 feet tall either. Just because they were ill prepared for this and were not really told what they were going into. They didn't really have the equipment or the training or hadn't trained for it properly. Doesn't mean that suddenly the Russian armed forces are useless or incompetent. They're certainly lacking motivation. I think the lesson that the Chinese might take from the Ukraine war, they can take all the sort of practical lessons of make sure you've got the right tires on your heavy vehicles, which have attracted a lot of attention recently. Make sure your troops know what it is they're going to be asked to do and that they're equipped and prepared for it. Make sure you don't create a traffic jam of your own making with your heavy vehicles. But I think the question of motivation and morale is going to be something which the Chinese will take away, because if they do get engaged in a hot war with any of their neighbours or indeed with Taiwan, then they're going to find a highly motivated opposition. And I think the traditions of Chinese military strategy, where you force your opponent to give in without a shot being fired, are ones which I think the Chinese will fall back on more reliably, oblige their neighbours to pay tribute to Beijing, rather than use, if you might say, an Anglo-Saxon way of doing things, which is sending the tanks and guns and try and impose yourself on the other side. So I hope that the Chinese military will draw a range of lessons from what they're witnessing in Ukraine, which will lead them away from thinking that there's a military solution to their challenges and their ambitions. It's not usually China that's victim of that. It's more often us in the West that are victims of those ideas, as we've witnessed over the last 20 years. But I think the Chinese might be usefully reminded of some of those things by what's happening in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank Sir John for his lucid commentary. I'd like to thank Michael and his team for this very timely and important report. And I'm going to invite my colleague Hannah, who's arranged everything today, to come up here just to say a couple of final things. Thank you very much for being involved today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir John Sawyers, for sharing your insights with us today. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure many people here will want to ask you some further questions over a drink. Thank you very much to our event partner, the National Bureau of Asian Research, for coming over from Washington to deliver this report in conjunction with us and have this fascinating conversation. And thank you to all of our speakers who took part. I will invite all of you to stay for some drinks and canapes and networking, but I'd like to give the final word to Michael Wills from the National Bureau of Asian Research for a couple of closing remarks. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Hannah. You've made my job easy because I realise I'm the only thing standing between everybody and a drink, so I will keep this very short. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Kerry, and all of your colleagues here at the Lau China Institute and King's College. It's been wonderful to partner with you on this event. My colleagues at NBR, Doug Strube, Jonathan Marek, Ali Salwinski, their work on this report it was critical to make it happen, and so they've been working incredibly hard. Thank you to them. All of our speakers, Emily de la Bruyere for leading the research team, Sam Hoffman, Greg Levesque, Nigel Corey, who joined us on screen today, and then, of course, Tim Stevens and Mark Marmino, who joined as King's College speakers today, and, of course, Sir John Sawyers for wonderful keynote remarks there. I need to thank the Institute of War and Peace Reporting and the State Department, which provided financial support for the report. It is an independent report. All of NBR's work is purely independent, but we do rely on grants and contributions to make our work possible. And finally, thank you. You've spent a couple hours with us today. I hope it's been worthwhile. These are a very complex set of questions, but the quality of the discussion that we've heard, the quality of questions that we've had from the audience suggests that I think we're all thinking about how best to deal with this very difficult situation. So with that, let me ask you all to join in one last round of applause.